Welcome to Latino Stories. If you love jaw-dropping HOA drama, you're in the right place. From corrupt board members to outrageous neighborhood disputes, we expose the wildest HOA scandals. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's dive into today's crazy HOA tale.
Imagine spending years trapped under the rule of a self-proclaimed HOA tyrant calls the police just because your community is having a simple cookout. Now imagine watching that same person get completely exposed, publicly humiliated, and taken away by the very officer she called for backup. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Have you ever had to deal with an out-of-control HOA, or maybe even a Karen of your own? Let us know in the comments. It started as a perfect summer afternoon, the kind where the air smelled like freshly cut grass. Kids rode their bikes down the cul-de-sac, and the sun cast long, golden rays across neatly trimmed lawns. The neighborhood was buzzing because today was the annual community cookout, a tradition that had been running for over a decade. Every year, families set up grills in driveways, tables overflowed with side dishes, and laughter filled the air as neighbors bonded over homemade recipes and shared stories. It was the one time of year where everyone truly came together. Well, almost everyone, because for the past 5 years, there had been one person who hated it. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the dictator of arbitrary rules, the woman who once tried to find a family for having a flag that wasn't aesthetically neutral enough. And this year, she had decided she wasn't going to allow the cookout to happen at all. It started with petty warnings, emails about unauthorized gatherings, and thinly veiled threats of fines for violating community event protocols. Then came the printed letters, slipped into mailboxes, claiming that outdoor cooking was now prohibited without written HOA approval. The neighborhood collectively rolled their eyes and ignored her, because everyone knew the HOA had never actually enforced such a rule before. But when the grills started firing up, the music started playing, and the smell of burgers and ribs filled the air, Karen escalated. She marched down the street like she was leading a military operation, clipboard in hand, snapping pictures of the cookout, muttering about violations. When she approached the first house, the Johnsons, she made her demand clear: shut this down immediately or face consequences. Mr. Johnson, holding a spatula and wearing an apron that said Grill Sergeant, simply laughed. Karen, it's a cookout, not a nightclub. Relax. That sent her into a full-blown tantrum. She started pointing at the speakers, the coolers, the kids playing cornhole in the yard. Each one, according to her, a violation of proper community standards. When nobody obeyed her, she did what Karen always did. She threatened fines. But this time, no one took her seriously. The neighbors had had enough. They knew Karen had no real power, that she was bluffing. And that's when her threats turned into rage. With her face flushed red, she pulled out her final weapon, her phone, with exaggerated dramatics. She dialed 911 and, in the most falsely panicked voice imaginable, she reported a dangerous and illegal gathering causing major disturbances in the neighborhood. As she screamed into the phone, claiming people were out of control and that the HOA was being disrespected, the entire neighborhood watched in disbelief. Karen had done a lot of ridiculous things over the years, but calling the police on a harmless cookout? This was next-level insanity. Nobody believed the cops would take her seriously. But then, in the distance, the sound of sirens cut to the summer air. The entire block fell silent. Karen folded her arms, victorious, watching as the patrol cars rolled up. The neighborhood had expected a fight, but what they didn't expect was for every single officer to end up staying for burgers. The second the police cruisers rolled into the neighborhood, the atmosphere shifted. The smell of grilled meat and charcoal still lingered in the air. The sun still shone brightly over neatly kept lawns, but now there was an unmistakable tension, a quiet hum of disbelief as neighbors exchanged looks. No one had actually thought the police would take Karen's call seriously, but here they were, 2 black and white squad cars rolling to a slow stop right in the middle of the cul-de-sac, their lights flashing but sirens mercifully off. From the other side of the street, Karen stood at her porch with her arms folded smugly across her chest, her expression radiating pure, unfiltered self-satisfaction. She had done it. She had called in the law to deal with the unruly peasants who had dared to defy her. The officer stepped out, sunglasses reflecting the afternoon sun, hands resting near their belts, their expressions unreadable as they scanned the scene in front of them. And what they saw was nothing even remotely close to what Karen had described. Instead of chaos, they were met with folding tables covered in potluck dishes, kids playing with water guns, lawn chairs spread out in driveways, and the distant sound of music playing softly from a Bluetooth speaker. In one driveway, a man flipped burgers on a massive grill, smoke rising lazily into the air. Someone called out, "Burgers are almost ready," completely oblivious to the unfolding drama. It was as wholesome as a neighborhood could possibly look. The lead officer, a tall man with a stoic face and a jawline sharp enough to cut steak, stepped forward and adjusted his sunglasses. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said, looking around, clearly confused. "Is there an issue here?" The entire block hesitated, waiting to see who would speak first. But before anyone could, Karen took it upon herself to take center stage. She practically marched across the street, her posture ramrod straight, her clipboard still clutched in her talon-like grip. Finally, she exhaled, as if she'd been waiting for years for this moment. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. As you can see, this event is completely out of control. There are unauthorized grills, open flames, alcohol being consumed in public, excessive noise, and worst of all, this entire gathering is in direct violation of our homeowners association regulations." The way she spoke, you would have thought she was reporting an underground fight club, not a cookout with lawn chairs and lemonade. The officers exchanged a quick glance. One of them, a younger cop with a barely concealed smirk, tilted his head and asked, "You said, out of control?" His tone was laced with pure skepticism. Karen, either too oblivious or too far gone in her own delusions, nodded vigorously. "Yes, people are completely disregarding community standards. These grills could be a fire hazard. There are people drinking." She gestured wildly toward a group of elderly neighbors holding plastic cups of lemonade. And worst of all, there was music playing over the acceptable decibel limit. The officer just stared at her. Music. Yes, extremely disruptive music. She pointed to the speaker sitting on someone's porch, currently playing what could only be described as light jazz. The entire neighborhood watched as the lead officer turned, looked at the crowd, then back at Karen, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. He sighed, pulled out a small notepad, and said in the most deadpan voice imaginable, "All right, who's in charge here?" Before anyone else could step forward, Karen leaped at the opportunity. "I am." She straightened her spine, holding her clipboard like it was a scepter. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association." There was a pause, a long, awkward pause. The lead officer flipped a page in his notebook, then looked back up. "Ma'am, this neighborhood doesn't have an HOA." The silence that followed could have knocked a bird out of the sky. Karen's smile faltered. "I what?" "We checked before we arrived," the officer continued, his voice laced with mild amusement. "This neighborhood voted against an HOA years ago. There's no legally recognized association here." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The neighbors? They were barely containing their laughter. Somewhere near the grill, someone choked on a sip of beer. But Karen, ever the stubborn villain, refused to back down. "That is completely incorrect," she snapped. "I have been running the HOA for the past 5 years. The lead officer nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's the problem." Karen's entire face went beet red. "What does that mean?" The younger officer, the one who had been holding back laughter, finally broke. "It means," he said, grinning, "that you're not in charge of anything." That was the moment the neighborhood lost it. The collective wave of laughter, suppressed chuckles, and even a few slow claps erupted all at once. Karen's expression morphed into something between sheer humiliation and unfiltered rage. But she wasn't done yet, because if the police weren't immediately shutting down the cookout, she still had one last move left to play. She squared her shoulders, pointed directly at the grills, and declared her final stand. "Fine, then enforce the fire hazard violations. Those grills are illegal under local fire codes." If you don't shut this down, you're neglecting public safety. The officers looked at the grills, then at each other, then back at Karen. And then the lead officer did something that no one, not even Karen, expected. The moment the words left Karen's mouth, the entire neighborhood went silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from shock or intimidation. It was the kind of silence that barely concealed a tidal wave of laughter just waiting to explode. Karen, still standing at the front lines of her personal war against the Cookout, had just demanded that the police enforce HOA fire codes. The lead officer, a man whose patience had already been tested beyond reason, slowly removed his sunglasses and let out a long, exasperated sigh. His partner, the younger cop who had barely managed to keep a straight face earlier, immediately turned away to avoid letting Karen see the grin spreading across his face. But Karen was dead serious. She squared her shoulders, lifted her clipboard like it was a legal document that held supreme power, and with the confidence of someone who had never read an actual law in her life, she began listing violations. These grills are completely illegal under HOA safety codes. Section 12, paragraph B, clearly states that all open flames must be kept at least 30 feet away from residential property lines. Furthermore, community gatherings over 10 people require prior written approval, and all music played outdoors must remain under 50 decibels. You are law enforcement officers. It is your duty to uphold these regulations. There was a pause, a long, agonizing pause. The officers exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations that can only be had between two people who are thinking the exact same thing. This woman is completely unhinged. The lead officer turned back to Karen, rubbing his temple as if he could actually feel a headache forming. "Ma'am," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly dense toddler, "we don't enforce HOA rules." Karen blinked. "Excuse me, we do not enforce HOA rules." He repeated it carefully, emphasizing each word like he was trying to make sure she absorbed them properly. HOA rules are civil agreements between residents. They are not enforceable by the police. Karen's jaw clenched. That's ridiculous. The younger officer finally lost it. He let out a sharp laugh, quickly disguised it as a fake cough. But it was too late. The neighborhood had heard it. A ripple of suppressed chuckles spread through the crowd, neighbors exchanging knowing smirks as they watched Karen's paper-thin authority crumble before their eyes. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no. She had spent years believing she had absolute power, and she wasn't about to let some underqualified local officers undermine her self-imposed reign. "You don't understand," she snapped, pointing a finger at the officers as if they were unruly schoolchildren. "I am Homeowners Association president. I am responsible for enforcing community standards, and I will not have lawlessness in my neighborhood." The lead officer tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You do realize we just established that this isn't a real HOA, right?" "That doesn't matter," Karen shot back. "The rules exist and they must be followed." The younger officer cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Ma'am, do you have any legally binding documentation proving that these rules were ever officially instated?" Karen hesitated. "I have." "That weren't made up by you personally?" She clamped her mouth shut. Busted. The entire neighborhood erupted in laughter. It was uncontrollable, rolling through the street like a wave of victory. Karen had nothing. No legal backing. No real authority. No actual power. She had spent years bullying people into submission, convincing new residents that she was more than just a bitter woman with too much free time, and now it was all unraveling. But in true Karen fashion, she refused to admit defeat. Instead, she went for the nuclear option. With wild desperation, she turned back to the officers, her face flushed with rage, and declared, "Fine. If you refuse to enforce the law, I will be reporting you for dereliction of duty and failure to maintain public safety standards. I demand your badge numbers." The silence that followed was so thick you could hear a burger sizzle on the grill. The lead officer tilted his head, then very calmly reached for his badge, unhooked it, and held it up right in front of her face. "Badge number 34719, he said flatly. "Would you like my supervisor's number too?" Karen turned an unnatural shade of purple. Before she could even respond, the younger officer stepped forward and grinned. "Would you like mine as well? Maybe we can all file reports against each other." That was it. That was the breaking point. The entire neighborhood lost it. The sheer spectacle of Karen being publicly humiliated by the very officers she had called was too much. People were clapping. Some were doubling over in laughter. And even the older residents who usually tried to keep the peace were barely containing their amusement. But Karen was seething. "This isn't funny," she shrieked. "This is an outrage." The lead officer nodded sagely. "It is." He then turned to the Cookout crowd, scanning the tables loaded with burgers, ribs, coleslaw, and ice-cold drinks. "You know, I think I need to take some time to make sure I got all the proper details of this situation." He turned to the younger officer. "You hungry?" The younger cop grinned. "Starving." And just like that, the officers walked past Karen, straight into the Cookout, and grabbed themselves a plate. The crowd cheered. Karen? She lost her mind. The moment the officers walked past Karen and grabbed themselves a plate, the entire mood of the neighborhood shifted. Would have been a tense standoff just moments before now felt like a victory parade as the crowd erupted into cheers and laughter. Karen, still rooted in place, looked like she had just swallowed a wasp, her entire face twisting in absolute disbelief as she watched the very people she had called for backup betray her in the most delicious way possible. The lead officer, completely unfazed by her fury, took a slow, deliberate bite of a perfectly grilled burger, nodding in approval as he chewed. "Damn," he finally said, "this is actually really good." The younger cop, already halfway through his first plate, gave a thumbs up to the grill master. "Who made these ribs?" someone called out. "That would be me," Mr. Johnson, the unofficial grill sergeant, announced proudly, flipping another batch of patties. "Secret family recipe." The officers grinned. "Well, consider me part of the family," the younger one joked, reaching for another. Meanwhile, Karen was on the verge of combusting. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no words came out. Only choking noises of pure rage. She spun in circles, looking for anyone to back her up, but there was no one left to defend her. Every single neighbor, even the ones who usually tried to avoid conflict, were now fully invested in watching her melt down. She stormed up to the lead officer, her entire body vibrating with frustration. "What are you doing?" she shrieked. "You're supposed to be shutting this down." The officer took another slow, exaggerated bite at his burger before answering. "Nah," he said simply. "Everything looks fine to me." The crowd burst into laughter again, and Karen's eye twitched so hard it looked like she might lose consciousness. "This is an illegal gathering," she screeched, stomping her foot like an angry toddler. "This is a fire hazard, a noise violation. You have to do something." The officer nodded thoughtfully, as if he were seriously considering her words. Then he reached for a cold drink from a cooler, cracked it open, and took a sip. "Yeah," he said after a moment, "I'm going to have to disagree with you there." The younger cop, now fully comfortable in a lawn chair, gave a dramatic stretch. "Honestly, this might be the most peaceful call we've had all day." A neighbor snorted into his beer. "Better than that scapegoat incident last week?" The younger officer laughed. "Oh, way better." Karen was shaking. She looked like she was about to self-destruct, her entire sense of control slipping through her fingers like sand. She turned to the neighborhood, pointing at random people. "Do something. You can't just let them get away with this." But instead of support, her own neighbors started turning on her. "Karen, just let it go," one woman sighed. "It's a cookout, not a crime scene." "Yeah," someone else chimed in. "Maybe if you stopped being such a buzzkill, you'd actually be invited next time." Karen looked personally offended by the very idea. "I wouldn't be caught dead at this barbaric event." That was a final straw, the moment that solidified her downfall, because, in response, the younger officer just grinned and took another bite of his ribs. "Then it sounds like this isn't your problem, ma'am." Karen's entire face turned beet red. She spun back to the lead officer, shaking with barely contained fury. "I demand to speak to your supervisor." The officer didn't even blink. "Sure thing." He pulled out his radio, pressed a button, and spoke calmly. Dispatch. This is Unit 24. We got a civilian requesting escalation to a supervisor. Static crackled. Then a voice came through. Unit 24. Can you confirm the nature of complaint? The officer glanced at Karen, then at the cookout, then back at his burger. Unauthorized grilling. There was a pause. Then the entire dispatch channel burst into laughter. Full on hysterical laughter. The kind that comes from seasoned officers who have heard everything, but never this. Even the lead officer couldn't help but smirk as the radio continued to crackle with barely contained amusement. Copy that. Unit 24 sounds like a real emergency. The entire neighborhood lost it. People were doubled over, wheezing with laughter. Someone actually fell out of their chair. Even the officers were struggling to keep a straight face. Karen? She looked like she was about to explode. You are all a disgrace to the badge, she bellowed. You will regret this. The lead officer wiped a stray tear of laughter from his eye and took another slow sip of his drink. Oh, yeah, he said, completely unbothered. How's that? Karen opened her mouth, ready to unleash another tirade. But she had nothing. No real laws, no authority, no HOA to back her up. Nothing. She had completely lost. And in that moment, standing there with her fake power dismantled, her neighbors laughing and the cops enjoying barbecue right in front of her, she realized it too. But Karen wasn't just defeated. She was humiliated. And if there was one thing a Karen couldn't handle, it was losing control. So, instead of admitting defeat like a rational human being, she did what every Karen does when they've lost an argument. She doubled down. And this time, she went nuclear. Karen stood in the middle of the cul-de-sac, her body vibrating with rage, fists clenched so tightly that her clipboard shook in her grip. The police had completely dismissed her authority. The neighborhood had openly mocked her, and worst of all, the cookout was still happening. Smoke from the grills curled into the sky, laughter echoed across the lawns, and the officers, the very people she had summoned for backup, were now sitting comfortably with plates full of ribs, burgers, and coleslaw. It was like watching her entire world fall apart in slow motion. Her last attempt at control, demanding to speak to a supervisor, had been laughed at over the police radio. The humiliation was unbearable. She had lost. But a true Karen doesn't back down. Instead, she implodes. And that's exactly what happened next. With an ear-piercing shriek, Karen ripped her clipboard in half. The paper fluttered to the ground like a pile of worthless demands. I will not be ignored, she bellowed, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. The lead officer, who had just taken another casual bite of his burger, didn't even look up. Ma'am, you are very much not being ignored. That set her off. She stormed across the yard, closing the distance between her and the officers, pointing an accusatory finger so aggressively that her entire arm trembled. You are supposed to uphold the law, she screamed, spittle flying. You are supposed to protect this community from people like this. She gestured wildly at the neighbors, who were still watching, thoroughly entertained. The younger officer, now leaning back in his lawn chair, raised an eyebrow. People like what? He asked. Folks eating burgers? Karen sputtered, realizing how ridiculous that sounded when said out loud. But instead of backtracking like a sane person, she doubled down. Yes, exactly. Look at this lawlessness. Open flames, unauthorized music, unregistered coolers. The officer blinked. Unregistered what now? Karen turned sharply toward the nearest table, where a large red cooler sat, brimming with drinks. She stomped over to it and, with theatrical rage, threw open the lid. What even is this? She demanded. Someone from the crowd helpfully peered over her shoulder. Looks like soda. Karen slammed the lid shut. You cannot just have alcohol in a public space. The lead officer, still entirely unbothered, slowly chewed his food and said, Ma'am, that's literally root beer. A pause. A long, agonizing pause. Karen's eye twitched so hard it could have counted as a medical emergency. But she wasn't finished. You, she pivoted back to the officers, are allowing this travesty, this She was so enraged that she couldn't even get the words out. And that's when she made her biggest mistake. With zero warning, she lunged toward the nearest grill, both hands reaching out as if she were about to shove it over. The entire neighborhood gasped. Even the officers, who had up until now been entirely unshaken by her antics, immediately jumped into action. The lead officer was on his feet in an instant, one firm hand catching Karen by the wrist before she could make contact. "Ma'am, step back." His voice had lost its casual amusement. It was now stern, professional, and entirely serious. Karen struggled against his grip, jerking back like a child throwing a tantrum. "Don't touch me," she shrieked. "This is an attack. This ma'am." His voice was sharp. "You just attempted to destroy someone's private property. That's criminal mischief." That single phrase, the weight of an actual law being thrown back at her, seemed to finally snap something in her brain. She froze, realizing that for the first time, she might have actually pushed too far. The neighbors were watching in stunned silence. The younger officer, who had up until now been relaxed and laughing, stood up as well, now radiating authority. "Do you understand that if you damage this grill, you'll be liable for it? You could be charged." Karen's mouth opened and closed. She looked at the officers, at the neighborhood, at the still intact grill, and for the first time, she seemed to be calculating her next move carefully. If she kept pushing, there was a real chance this would end in handcuffs. Her eyes darted from face to face, looking for anyone to support her, but there was no one left. The neighbors were done with her. The officers were done with her. And for the first time in what was probably her entire miserable reign over this community, she realized that she had no power here. Slowly, her posture changed. The defiance drained from her body. She straightened up, forcing herself to regain some level of dignity, and with a sharp inhale, she took a step back from the grill. "I will be filing a formal complaint," she said stiffly. The lead officer nodded, entirely unimpressed. "You do that." Karen's face twitched. She had lost. The cookout was still happening. The police weren't shutting it down. And now, after publicly embarrassing herself, attempting to damage property, and being physically stopped by law enforcement, there was nothing left for her to do, except retreat. With one final glare at the officers, she turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house, her entire body vibrating with barely contained rage. The crowd watched as she slammed her front door shut, so hard that a wreath fell off a neighboring house. And just like that, she was gone. The silence hung for a moment. Then, as if a collective agreement had been reached, the entire neighborhood burst into cheers. "Best cookout ever," someone yelled. The officers, they sat back down, refilled their plates, and continued eating like nothing had happened. But this wasn't over, because while Karen had lost the battle, she was about to lose something even bigger. The cookout was back in full swing. Burgers sizzled on the grill, music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker, and neighbors still chuckled amongst themselves, replaying Karen's meltdown like it was a season finale of their favorite drama series. The officers, still seated with plates stacked high, had become honorary guests, laughing with the community like they had been invited in the first place. But while Karen had retreated inside her house, it was clear to everyone that this wasn't over. Karen didn't just throw tantrums and walk away. She plotted. She schemed. She lived to make other people miserable. But the problem with being a lifelong manipulator is that eventually you slip up, and Karen had slipped up big time. The first sign that something bigger was happening came when Susan, one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood, approached the officers with a stack of documents in her hands. Susan had never liked Karen, but unlike the rest of the neighborhood, who merely endured her nonsense, Susan had been collecting evidence. And now, she saw the perfect opportunity to finally expose Karen for everything she had been doing behind the scenes. She set the paperwork on the table in front of the lead officer, who raised an eyebrow and wiped his hands before flipping through the first few pages. Then he frowned. "What am I looking at here?" he asked, flipping another page. Susan smiled. "That," she said, "is proof that Karen's been running a completely fake HOA for years." That got everyone's attention. The younger officer straightened in his seat, setting his drink down, while the neighbors who were eavesdropping leaned in a little closer. The lead officer glanced up at her, then at the pages. Explain. Susan pulled out the first document. This is a printed version of Karen's HOA bylaws. She rolled her eyes. Except this neighborhood doesn't have an HOA. She just printed out her own set of rules, put herself in charge, and started enforcing them like they were real. The officers exchanged a look. That was already bad. But Susan wasn't finished. She flipped to the next page. This is a copy of the fines she's been handing out. See that? She pointed to a table with various violations listed. She's been issuing these for years. And here, she flipped another page, is proof that she's actually been collecting money from people who didn't know any better. The entire block went dead silent. The younger officer let out a low whistle. She's been making people pay? Susan nodded, especially the new homeowners. She tells them it's mandatory. She turned another page. Here are the payment records. And here's a bank statement where she deposited thousands of dollars labeled as HOA dues. The lead officer rubbed his temple, suddenly looking exhausted. You're telling me this woman has been collecting HOA fees for an HOA that doesn't exist? Susan grinned. Yep. The neighborhood erupted. There were gasps, murmurs, whispered curses, and full-on laughter. Mr. Johnson, the grill master, shook his head and muttered, Unbelievable. Another neighbor, who had moved in only a year ago, looked personally offended. She scammed me out of $300. Karen had always been a nightmare, but this was actual fraud. The younger officer leaned forward, flipping through the documents himself. This is bad. The lead officer nodded. Yeah, really bad. And then, as if on cue, the front door to Karen's house swung open. Karen stepped outside, clearly refreshed from screaming into her pillows, and immediately froze when she saw that everyone, including the officers, was now discussing paperwork with extreme interest. Her eyes darted to the stack of documents, her expression flickering between panic and rage. What is this? She demanded, storming toward them. The lead officer didn't even look up. You tell me, ma'am. We're just going over some community paperwork. Karen's eyes locked onto Susan, and her face twisted with pure venom. You had no right. Susan cut her off. I had every right. You've been illegally scamming people for years. And now, she gestured to the officers. Looks like it's finally catching up to you. Karen turned to the officers, her expression wild. This is absurd. This is slander. The lead officer tilted his head. Ma'am, this is bank evidence. That's not slander, that's fraud. Karen flinched. For the first time, the smugness was gone. The officers weren't ignoring her anymore. Now they were investigating her. The younger officer pulled out his radio and spoke into it. Dispatch, can you run a check on a homeowner here? We got a potential case of financial fraud linked to falsified HOA fees. Karen went pale. This wasn't a fine she could bluff her way out of. This wasn't a neighbor she could intimidate. This was an actual criminal investigation. And suddenly, she realized just how screwed she was. The lead officer stood, finally looking Karen in the eyes, and said the words that sent her entire world crumbling down. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning. The neighborhood gasped. Karen? She looked like she was about to faint. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe beg, but nothing came out. And just like that, the woman who had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood with fake rules, fake fines, and fake authority was now being taken away by real cops for real crimes. And the best part? The cookout was still going. As Karen was escorted to the police car, Mr. Johnson flipped another burger, the smell of grilled meat filling the air. The younger officer, watching Karen sulk in the back seat, glanced over at the table of food and grinned. Think I got time for another plate? The lead officer smirked. Might as well. We're already here. And with that, the cops sat back down, resumed eating, and the neighborhood cheered like their favorite sports team had just won the championship. Karen was finished. But the night was just getting started. Karen sat in the back of the police car, her expression a mix of shock, fury, and sheer disbelief. For years, she had ruled this neighborhood with an iron clipboard. issuing fake fines, inventing ridiculous HOA rules, and bullying anyone who dared to challenge her. But now she was the one facing real consequences. The very people she had tormented, the neighbors who had once begrudgingly tolerated her nonsense, were laughing, celebrating, and eating barbecue while she sat in the back of a squad car. And the worst part? The officers weren't in a hurry to leave. They were still eating, still enjoying themselves, still ignoring her. It was like watching her entire world fall apart, one bite of a burger at a time. But while Karen was sinking into a pit of panic, the neighborhood was just getting started. Susan, standing near the table of paperwork, turned to the officers and asked, "So, what happens next?" The lead officer, still chewing on his food, shrugged. "Well, she'll be taken in for questioning. The financial fraud side of things will probably be handed off to the city investigators. If she's been running this fake HOA and collecting money, she could be looking at fines, maybe worse." The younger officer smirked. Imagine that. A fake HOA president getting real fines. The crowd loved that. Someone actually clinked a drink against another in celebration. But Susan wasn't finished. That's great and all, but we still need to deal with the rest of her mess. She's been harassing us for years, and even if she gets fined, she'll still be living here. We need to make sure she can't pull this stunt again. That's when the real HOA board member stepped forward. See, Karen had always called herself the HOA president, but the reality was there actually was a small HOA board, one that existed purely for minor community maintenance issues and never enforced Karen's fake rules. They had been pushed to the sidelines for years, too exhausted to fight Karen's constant overreach. But now they had proof that Karen had committed fraud, and they weren't going to let her keep her fake reign any longer. One of the board members, a retired lawyer named Mr. Davenport, stepped forward and adjusted his glasses. Legally, Karen was never an official part of our HOA, but she has been acting as if she were in charge. We have every right to file an official complaint and permanently bar her from ever being involved in any neighborhood decisions. Another board member, Mrs. Chong, nodded. "I say we vote to officially remove her from any position of influence, effective immediately." The crowd cheered. The younger officer, clearly enjoying every moment of this, tilted his head. "Oh man, you're actually holding a vote? Right here." Susan smirked. "Might as well. She always said she spoke on behalf of the HOA, right? Let's see what the real HOA has to say." The entire neighborhood gathered in a circle, all in favor of permanently banning Karen from the HOA, from enforcing any rules, and from harassing homeowners under the guise of authority. Say aye. Aye. The vote was unanimous. Karen, still in the squad car, must have heard the roar of victory because suddenly she was banging on the window. "This is illegal. You can't do this. I'm the president." The lead officer, now holding another burger, turned his head lazily toward her and raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, we literally just confirmed that you are, in fact, not the president." Karen's face turned a new shade of red. She looked like she wanted to physically explode out of the police car. The neighbors? They were thriving. People were clapping. Some were calling friends to tell the news, and others were already drafting up official paperwork to make sure Karen could never fake another rule again. And the final humiliation? Susan, ever the queen of pettiness, walked up to the police car and tapped on the window. Karen glared at her like a rabid animal. "What?" Susan grinned. "You're trespass from my property, Karen." Karen's screech could probably be heard 3 streets over, but she couldn't do a damn thing about it. The cookout? It continued. The neighborhood? It had won. Karen? She had lost everything. And as the officers finally packed up and left, taking Karen with them for further questioning, the last thing anyone saw was her fuming in the back seat, completely powerless. The younger officer rolled down his window and called out, "Thanks for the food. Best call we've had all week." The crowd cheered again. The night carried on without Karen, without fake fines, without HOA nonsense. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a real community. And the cookout became legendary. Final thoughts. Karen's downfall wasn't just about her getting caught. It was about an entire community standing together against someone who thought she could control everyone through fear and manipulation. And in the end, she was left with nothing. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood, they had burgers, drinks, and freedom. And that was the best victory of all.